You won't believe what happened after the HOA decided to let my neighbors park in my private warehouse. The situation escalated in ways I never could have imagined. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. I had been living in the neighborhood for years and never had much trouble with the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA was one of those entities that seemed to exist in the background, making sure lawns were well-kept and mailboxes were in good shape. To be honest, I didn't pay much attention to them until they started becoming more involved with the community. They would send out periodic newsletters and occasionally remind everyone about the importance of maintaining the standards set for the neighborhood. But other than that, things were usually quiet. My property was one of the larger ones in the area, and I had a warehouse in the back, which I used for personal storage. It wasn't anything fancy, just a functional space where I kept old furniture, tools, and seasonal items. I had never thought about it as anything more than a storage unit for my own belongings, but apparently, the HOA had a different idea. It all started with a letter. The envelope was a standard white one with the HOA's logo in the top corner, and at first, I thought it was just another reminder about lawn maintenance or a new policy about garbage bins. But when I opened it, I was shocked by its contents. The letter stated that the HOA had received several complaints about parking issues in the neighborhood. Apparently, residents were having trouble finding spaces on the street, and some had even been parking in front of people's driveways, causing frustration. The letter went on to explain that the HOA had decided to take action to resolve the issue by asking residents with large private properties to consider offering their space for overflow parking. And then came the unexpected request. They want to know if I would be willing to allow homeowners to park their vehicles in my private warehouse. At first, I thought it was a joke. Why would the HOA think that I would be okay with letting complete strangers park in my warehouse? They even mentioned that there could be some compensation involved, which felt like an afterthought. The more I thought about it, the more irritated I became. My warehouse was not a public parking garage. I had never signed up to let anyone park there, and the thought of strangers driving onto my property and potentially damaging it made me uneasy. The letter didn't give me much of a choice. It almost implied that the HOA had already decided on this solution, and it was up to me to agree. If I didn't respond within a certain time frame, they would assume I was on board, as if I didn't have the right to say no. That's when I realized they were treating my private property like it was community property, which felt completely wrong to me. The letter also mentioned the community benefit that would come from alleviating the parking problem, but I didn't see how allowing others to use my warehouse would benefit me or my property in any way. It seemed to be more about the HOA solving their own problem at my expense, and I wasn't having it. I wasn't even sure why they thought parking in my warehouse was a viable solution. My property wasn't designed for it. It was a warehouse, not a parking lot. But what bothered me the most was the assumption that my property was fair game for their use without asking for my consent first. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just a matter of inconvenience. It was about respect for property rights. I was tempted to call them and refuse outright, but I didn't want to escalate things too quickly. I decided to wait for a few days, hoping that the HOA would realize how unreasonable the request was. Maybe they'd back off or find another solution. But the silence was deafening. A week passed, and I heard nothing from them, so I started to think that they had just given up. But then I got a follow-up email from the HOA president, this time informing me that they had arranged for members to park in my warehouse starting that week. I couldn't believe it. They had gone ahead and started parking cars in my warehouse without waiting for my response. It was clear they didn't take my property rights seriously. I immediately called the HOA to demand an explanation. The president apologized, but insisted that they had already set up arrangements with a few members of the neighborhood who were having parking issues. She assured me that they would only be parking for short periods and that my warehouse was just a temporary solution. But that didn't sit well with me. It wasn't about how long they were parking for. It was about the principle of it. I had never agreed to this arrangement, and they had no right to use my property without my consent. The conversation ended with me reiterating that I was not okay with any cars being parked on my property, but it seemed like the HOA had already made up their mind. They had taken the initiative to park cars there and were treating my objections as a minor inconvenience. When I arrived home later that afternoon, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were 3 cars parked in my warehouse, one in the front, one in the middle, and another near the back. The nerve! I had made it clear I didn't want anyone parking there, and yet here they were, disrespecting my wishes and taking over my private space. I didn't know what to do at first. I was seething with frustration. My first instinct was to call the HOA again, but then I realized that they had completely disregarded my concerns. This was no longer about trying to negotiate with them. It was about taking control of the situation. I had to take action to show them that my property was not theirs to use at will. I immediately called a towing company. The HOA hadn't provided any sort of warning or permission to park, so I figured the cars were parked illegally on my property. I told the towing company to remove all 3 vehicles immediately. When the tow trucks arrived, I watched as the cars were loaded up, and I felt a rush of satisfaction. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. This wasn't just about the cars. It was about sending a clear message that my property was off limits. But when I returned home later that evening, I saw more cars parked in my warehouse. The HOA had taken matters into their own hands again, clearly ignoring my objections. They had told residents to park there anyway, and it was beginning to feel like they were intentionally testing my patience. After the first set of cars had been towed from my warehouse, I thought things would calm down. Surely, the HOA would recognize that I wasn't okay with this arrangement and would stop sending cars to park on my private property. I expected some sort of apology, or at least an acknowledgement that they had overstepped their boundaries. Instead, what happened next was nothing short of infuriating. As I mentioned earlier, when I returned home that evening after having the cars towed, I was shocked to find even more vehicles parked in my warehouse. The audacity of it was unreal. I had made it clear, through both my phone call and the towing action, that I did not want people parking on my property. Yet here I was, facing the exact same problem all over again. This time, it wasn't just 3 cars. There were 5 vehicles parked in the warehouse, all lined up neatly and taking up every available spot. I felt the blood rush to my face as my frustration boiled over. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a direct violation of my property rights. The HOA had ignored my objections, and worse, they were now openly disregarding my wishes. I immediately called the HOA president. I demanded an explanation for why they had continued to send cars to park in my warehouse despite my clear refusal. The conversation that followed was maddening. The HOA president apologized again, but insisted that they were just trying to help by offering a parking solution to the community. She claimed that the neighbors had started to rely on the warehouse for their parking, and she explained that some of the families involved were going through difficult situations, as though that justified their blatant disrespect on my property. She even said that I was causing undue hardship for the community by not cooperating, implying that I was being selfish for not allowing them to use my space. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It felt like she was trying to guilt-trip me into accepting the arrangement, as though the HOA's needs were more important than my rights as a homeowner. I knew at that point that I couldn't just keep allowing this to happen. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was an outright defiance of my authority as the owner of the property. I had tried to be reasonable, but clearly, the HOA wasn't taking me seriously. It was time for a different approach, something more drastic. The towing of the cars hadn't deterred them, but I knew what I had to do to make them realize I was not someone to be ignored. I decided to escalate the situation in a way that would get their attention once and for all. I called a local towing company again and arranged for them to be on call, prepared to remove any cars that were parked in my warehouse. This wasn't just going to be a one-time event anymore. I was going to take a hard stand. If the HOA and the neighbors thought they could just keep using my property, they were about to learn a very valuable lesson. The next morning, I woke up early and went to check the warehouse. Sure enough, there were cars parked in there again. It was like clockwork. The HOA had already instructed the members to park there, and it felt like they were intentionally testing me. I felt a surge of anger as I realized just how far they were willing to push things. I called the towing company immediately. Within an hour, the tow trucks arrived and the cars were hauled away once again. But this time, I didn't just let the towing company take care of things. I made sure to take photos and document everything. I wanted to make sure I had evidence that I had taken reasonable steps to prevent this from happening. This wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about making sure that if this escalated into something bigger, I would have a record of the situation. It didn't take long for the neighbors to start noticing. Word spread quickly throughout the community that my warehouse was no longer a parking lot, and people were understandably upset. Some came to my door, knocking and asking why I had decided to tow their cars. Others left notes in my mailbox, accusing me of being unreasonable. The pressure was mounting, and I could feel the tension in the neighborhood rising. Some of the neighbors who had previously supported the HOA's decision to park in my warehouse were starting to turn against me. They had been hoping for a quick fix to the parking issue, and now they were faced with the reality that their cars were being towed, sometimes with no warning. I understood their frustration, but that didn't change the fact that this was my property, and I had every right to decide what happened on it. The HOA, on the other hand, wasn't backing down. In fact, they doubled down on their efforts to get me to relent. They sent another letter, this time more formal, demanding that I allow the parking situation to continue and that I work with the community to find a more acceptable solution. The tone of the letter was condescending, and it felt like they were trying to intimidate me into giving in. The HOA even threatened that if I continued to resist, they might take legal action, claiming that my refusal to cooperate was causing undue harm to the community. This was starting to feel like a battle I wasn't prepared to fight. But at the same time, I couldn't let them walk all over me. I wasn't just going to give up my property for them to use as a public parking lot. I had to make a choice, either back down and let them continue using my warehouse, or stand my ground and make sure they understood that I wasn't going to tolerate this kind of overreach. I chose to stand my ground. I called my lawyer to get advice on the matter. After discussing my options, I was reassured that I had every right to deny them access to my property and that they couldn't force me to let them use it, no matter how much pressure they applied. The HOA didn't have the legal right to tell me what I could or couldn't do with my own property. This gave me the confidence to keep moving forward with my plan. I decided to be proactive about it. Every day, I checked the warehouse to make sure no one was parking there. And when they did, I made sure the cars were towed right away. The neighbors were beginning to realize that this was not going to be a simple problem to solve. Some started to change their tune, apologizing to me for the inconvenience they had caused. Others, however, became more vocal in their complaints. A few went as far as to start a petition against me, asking the HOA to intervene and force me to open my property to the parking arrangement. I wasn't intimidated. I knew I was in the right, and I wasn't going to let the community or the HOA bully me into giving in. The battle was far from over, but I was prepared to keep fighting. I had made my stance clear. No one was parking in my warehouse again. And if they continued to push, I would keep towing every single car that showed up. There was no compromise on my property rights. By this point, I had reached my limit. The ongoing battle with the HOA and the persistent parking situation was weighing on me. What started as a simple request to let my neighbors park in my private warehouse had transformed into an ongoing battle for control over my own property. After countless phone calls, emails, and confrontations, I knew that I couldn't let the HOA push me around any longer. Every time they sent cars to park in my warehouse, I towed them, but I had this growing sense that it wasn't enough. I needed to send a stronger message. No longer was I just responding to inconvenience. I had to take decisive action to make it clear that this wasn't just a small issue for me. This was about protecting my rights, defending my space, and showing everyone that I wouldn't back down. The tipping point came when I returned home one evening to find my warehouse yet again filled with cars. It was almost laughable at that point how relentless they had become. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger rising inside me. Despite the towing, the letters, and the warnings, they had once again ignored my objections. It seemed like the HOA and some of the neighbors were determined to wear me down, to make me feel like I had no choice but to accept this invasion of my property. But I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't going to be bullied, I wasn't going to be swayed, and I wasn't going to back down. The stakes were too high, and I had to finish this once and for all. I immediately called the towing company once again. I wasn't going to allow this to continue. I told them that I wanted every single car parked in my warehouse to be towed, regardless of who owned them. I had reached the point where I was no longer willing to negotiate. My property was mine to control, and I wasn't going to let anyone treat it like a public parking lot. The moment I made that call, I knew I was stepping into uncharted territory. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of towing a few cars and hoping things would calm down. This was going to be a confrontation. It was going to send a message to the HOA, to my neighbors, and anyone else who thought they could use my property without my permission. Within the hour, the tow trucks showed up. I watched as the vehicles, one by one, were lifted off my property. The noise of the tow trucks hauling the cars away felt almost therapeutic. It wasn't just the cars being towed. It was the satisfaction of reclaiming my space. It was the satisfaction of knowing that I was standing up for what was right. I had done everything I could to avoid this situation. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to find a compromise. But when the HOA continued to push the envelope and sent more and more cars to park on my property, I knew that there was no longer room for negotiation. The message had to be loud and clear. This was not their space to use. As the final car was towed away, I could almost feel the weight of the situation lifting off my shoulders. But at the same time, I knew it wasn't over. I had taken action, but I had no illusion that this would be the last time I would face resistance. I could already imagine the phone calls, the emails, and the confrontations with my neighbors and the HOA that would follow. I had made my decision, and I had to be prepared to see it through to the end. That evening, the first set of complaints began rolling in. Neighbors started to knock on my door, asking why their cars had been towed, demanding explanations. Some of them were upset, others were just confused, but they all wanted answers. I listened patiently, but I didn't back down. I calmly explained that this was my property and that I had made it clear several times that I didn't want anyone parking there. I told them that I understood their frustration, but my decision wasn't about their convenience. It was about protecting my rights as a property owner. I wasn't going to let anyone use my warehouse without my permission. I wasn't being selfish, as some claimed. I was simply exercising my right to control what happens on my property. It wasn't an easy conversation to have, but it was a necessary one. While some of the neighbors accepted my explanation and began to understand my position, others weren't so easy to convince. Some continued to argue, calling me selfish and unreasonable. A few even started a petition, hoping to rally support for reversing my decision. But I wasn't moved by their words. I had already heard the arguments, and I knew where I stood. This wasn't just about the inconvenience it caused. This wasn't just about the parking problem. This was about the principle that no one should be able to use my property without my permission, regardless of how much they needed it. My warehouse wasn't a public parking garage, and I wasn't going to treat it as such. The HOA's response was just as expected. They called me the next day, demanding that I reverse my decision and allow the parking to continue. They made a whole list of excuses, telling me how much the parking issue was affecting the community. They even promised that the parking situation would only be temporary, that they would find a more permanent solution in the future. But I wasn't having it. They had ignored my wishes for too long, and now they were trying to guilt-trip me into backing down. They claimed that my refusal was hurting the community, that it was causing undue hardship for the families who had nowhere to park. I didn't care about their excuses. The HOA was not going to dictate what I did with my property, not now, not ever. I calmly explained to them once again that this wasn't about convenience. It was about my rights, and I wasn't going to let them violate those rights. They could threaten me with legal action if they wanted, but I wasn't afraid. I knew I was in the right, and I had the law on my side. It didn't take long before the HOA realized they weren't going to get their way. Slowly, the pressure from the neighbors started to fade as well. Some of them started to accept my decision, realizing that I wasn't going to budge. Others simply stopped bothering me. But there was still a small faction of people who continued to complain. They tried to rally support for another petition, but by that time, it was clear that most of the neighborhood had moved on. As the weeks passed, the situation died down. The HOA stopped sending cars to park in my warehouse, and the complaints from my neighbors became fewer and farther between. Eventually, the parking issue was resolved without further interference from the HOA, and my warehouse was once again just a private storage space free from any outside intrusion. I had one. Looking back, I realized that this whole experience had been more than just about parking spaces. It had been about standing up for myself and my property. It had been about asserting my rights and making it clear that no one, not the HOA or anyone else, had the right to take what was mine. And in the end, it was worth it. I had fought for my rights, and I had come out on top.